They took those chairs. I was looking forward to sitting down for a change. Reason I was looking forward to sitting down. A few weeks ago, you might remember when Brad preached, a couple weeks before Ben had preached, and Ben's sermon checked in at somewhere around 23 minutes, which we don't allow that around here, by the way. But Brad preached and just said because Ben's sermon was so short, he was going to make up for the balance and try to get everything tilted back. Last week, if you weren't here when Brad preached, it clocked in somewhere at around 56 minutes. So to get the balance back the way it is, we'll see you all next week. So, I'm just kidding. I've got a solid hour for you all today, so we're good to go. I would like to welcome you into Crossroads. If you're here in person, if you're joining us online, we're glad that you've joined us today. It is officially summertime. We've hit that mark a couple weeks ago. I think we hit the official summertime mark. But I noticed something, and I wrote this in the newsletter this week. Summertime as a parent is not nearly as fun as summertime was as a kid. Like, I think about this because as a kid, I'm thinking back to my summers as a elementary school, even middle school aged kid. It revolved around baseball and riding my bikes around the neighborhood. And, this was still the era before everybody had cell phones. And so nobody had a clue where you were. They just assumed you were still alive somewhere. And man, I thought about how much fun that was. A lot of hanging out with my friends or playing Super Nintendo or those types of things. As a parent, summertime is miserable. All my kids do is whine and complain because they're bored. Because none of their other friends are currently online with them. And I just thought a lot about this because the more I stop and think about the way things used to be, the more I realize I'm just turning into my dad day by day, and I'm really not that happy about that. But I'm probably not the only one. It's actually kind of been fun diving into this summer as we stop and think back. We've gotten into a new show, and I say new, I've told you this before. We're very good at diving on to the trend of a TV show several years after it was on TV. Our current one is Young Sheldon. We've been watching that on Netflix. It just ended, so I feel like we aren't too far behind that one. But we always used to watch The Big Bang Theory, and so we started watching this prequel show. And part of the reason that we really love it, we love the characters, number one, but number two, the character of Sheldon is only about a year older than me. And so we're watching him. If you haven't seen it, it's set like in 1989 to 1990, 91, thereabouts, when he's about a 9 to 10, 11-year-old kid. And so for a lot of ways, it's really like looking back into the past for me and seeing how I was raised, because a lot of the things that they talk about and they do, like we had those. The fun part is explaining to my kids what those things are. Like the other day, we had to explain what a Walkman is. Remember those? Which then meant I had to explain what a cassette tape is. And suddenly, the more I'm explaining these things, I realize why my dad was in such a bad mood when he was raising me all the time. Because it's like, he would always tell me, read a book. I tell my kids, Google it, look it up. There's answers everywhere. You don't need to ask me every single question to everything. But I thought a lot about that, and I was thinking more this week because I'm watching this show, and it was my era growing up. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Sandlot. It came out, and I think part of the reason it connected with me, I was 11 when it came out. The boys in the movie are about 11, 12 years old. And Scott Smalls, I'm pretty sure, was written after me, the nerdy kid who couldn't fit in with the athletes. But I loved that show, and my dad loved it too because that was his era. Now, that was a few years before because it was the early 60s. My dad was born in 1959. But it was flashback to him as a kid, growing up and just playing baseball all year long, all summer long, getting out on your bikes, going and doing all these things. And I think when we do this, when we start to look back and we think about what we did as kids compared to what our kids do as kids or the current generation of kids are doing as kids, we all kind of have this similar mindset. Man, we had it good. Or maybe you say we had it better. I think about this because as I stop and look back, I catch myself kind of asking myself one of two questions. What is it that I wish that my kids could experience that I experienced growing up that society today doesn't allow? And the other side of that is, what do I look back and realize we experienced as kids that I don't want my kids to have to experience? I think about that a lot because as we look forward into the future, obviously everything just changes day by day. One of the things that kind of comes to my mind when I was a kid, this time of the year, I would spend a lot of time with my grandparents at the lake. They had campers on either side of Grand Lake. I'd be at my dad's folks, usually camping with them. It was a little bit more fun. There was more stuff to do at their campground than where my other grandparents camped, which was just trailers and a boat ramp. But I thought about this because when we woke up in the morning, we just took off. We left the camper, we'd be down at the water, we'd be at the playground, we'd be exploring through the woods. And guess what my grandparents did? Nothing. They just assumed we were still alive. They're like, you know what, if they're not back in 4 or 5 days, then we'll worry. We'll start to look for them. And I loved that time as a kid. Of course, this is, before we all had devices in our hands. I took my kids camping last summer in my dad's camper. We weren't in a tent. We were glamping. I'll be honest about this. We were glamping in his very nice travel trailer. It was the worst 3 days of my life because my kids complained nonstop. You know their biggest complaint? The Wi-Fi is slow. Like, we're camping. There's Wi-Fi. I think we look back and we realize how good we had it, but also maybe occasionally wonder, what would it be like to be raised in this current generation? Bill Watterson is the creator of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. He said this great line that really stuck with me. You know what's weird? Day by day, nothing seems to change, but pretty soon, everything's different. I think we can all relate to that. Maybe it's seeing somebody's kids for the first time in several months. Like, man, he has gotten taller. Man, look at this young woman she's become. We don't see that necessarily day by day. But when you look back after a few years, like, wow, we got from here to here. Man, what happened? Think about this because, again, time changes. Every generation that comes and goes does things a little differently than the generation before it. Not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily a good thing. It just is what it is. I do things differently than my parents did things, who did things differently than their parents did things, and I'm already seeing my kids do things differently than I do. Doesn't mean I'm right, they're wrong, or vice versa. It just is what it is. The world around us changes. In fact, you've heard it said many times, the only constant in life is what? It's change. Lives change. Culture changes, people change, society changes, and as a result, generations change. And one of our major issues we have in our culture and society is that we categorize ourselves. We fall into certain demographics. Maybe that is socioeconomic, maybe it's where you live, maybe it is where you're from, or maybe it's generational. And too often when we look into our little category of these demographics, we kind of get this mindset that, you know what, we've got it figured out, these other groups don't. And that's a dangerous mentality because our culture and our society, I don't need to tell you this, but it's full of division. It's full of fracture. It's full of we're right, you're wrong, and you need to get on board or there's going to be problems. And we're starting to see that even within the church itself. We're starting this new series today called Generations, and the purpose behind this is very simple. One thing that we can all be guilty of is, again, looking at the generations that are coming up underneath us. And before you think I'm pointing the finger at you, as I said, I'm quickly becoming my own father. And I'm starting to have some of these same thoughts and complaints towards younger people. And I don't want that. Because just because people do things differently doesn't mean it's wrong. My thought behind this series is simple. The more we can get to know each other better, the better we can love one another. And the better we as a church especially can love one another, the better we together can fulfill our mission. That we can go into all the world and make disciples of all nations and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's why the tagline to this series is simple. All of us need each of us. As a collective, all of us need each of us. What we're going to do over the next few weeks here is we're going to look at the 5 major generations at play in our culture, specifically the 5 major generations that have adults in our culture today. Now, you might notice that there's one generation at the very beginning that we're not going to talk about here. We're not talking about the greatest generation. There are still a handful of people from the greatest generation around at this point, pretty much aged about 95 and up. But given the fact that most of adult culture and society falls into one of these 5 generations. These are what we're going to focus on over the next few weeks. Curious today, as we get ready to talk about this, we're going to talk about the silent generation today from 1928 to 45. Who fits into that category? Show of hands. There's a handful of you all in here. 8 o'clock, I didn't ask them to raise their hands. And one of them said, I almost got up beside you and just stood there. And I said, well, you should have. I said, you should have stood right beside me the whole time. That would have been fun if you would have done that. Who fits into the baby boomer generation? That's probably a lot of you in the room in here. Okay, you're the ones that have caused all of our problems. Thank you. Gen X, who fits into Gen X in here? Yeah, there's the greatest generation. The millennials, a few of y'all. And what about Gen Z? I know there's at least a couple of y'all. There's more of that in here. Okay, a few Gen Zers in here. Now, a lot of you may be like me. I was born in 1982, and so I fall technically into the millennials, but really until a few years ago, I was actually in Gen X. They kind of shifted the years a little bit because they see how trends go with different people and different groups of people. But a lot of you may fall close to a cutoff year, and you're going to be like, I'm kind of this one, and I'm also kind of this one. That's fine. You can be too. That's fine. We're not going to have a test later and say if you're not in this one, you have to leave and go somewhere else. So you can be in whichever one of these you want to be in. Today, though, we're going to talk about the silent generation. Let me just tell you from the top, this series is going to be a little different than what we normally do here, because I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a history lesson before we dive into too much of this. Because what I want to do is look at each of these 5 generations, talk about what it was that was going on in our world around us, in culture, in society, in history, and maybe a little pop culture, because we were molded by the world around us. We were molded by what was taking place around us. And the more I think we understand that, we understand a little bit about how these generations came to be what they are. This silent generation is interesting. We call them the silent generation because really it's a generation that wasn't heavily politically active. They weren't like their parents in the greatest generation or the baby boomers that followed. They were more of a generation that just put their nose to the grindstone and worked and built a life and built a world around them. In fact, until our current president, until President Biden, nobody from the silent generation had been elected to be president. The last few presidents before were all from the baby boomers, and the few before that were part of the greatest generation. It's a generation that simply wanted to get busy building a life. In fact, that's another name we can call this generation, are the builders. But it's a generation that when you stop and think about what brackets those years of 1928 to 1945, you start to get a lot of sense of how this generation turned out the way that they did. This was a generation that was born roughly during the Great Depression. Generation that was born between the crash of Wall Street in 1929 and World War II, which was the deadliest conflict in human history. Think about that for just a second. Those are the 2 brackets of this generation. If you're curious just a little bit here about how this generation came to be what it was and what it was raised in, think about this for a moment. Last month in May, according to government websites, unemployment in the U.S. was 4%. In 1933, it was 24.8%. Roughly 1 in 4 Americans either couldn't find a job or they were finding a job that paid very, very little. You couple this with the Dust Bowl that affected this part of the country, Kansas, Oklahoma, down into Texas, where poor farming techniques met with harsh drought conditions. This was just a very, very rough time to be born and to be raised. Many people lost everything they had and set off across the country just trying to find something somewhere for the hope of a better tomorrow. This was a generation that was raised in conditions just about as bad as you could imagine. Now, a lot of you have seen pictures like these over the course of time. Maybe you've seen them in history books. This is a very famous picture that kind of depicts people in the Dust Bowl and in the Great Depression. My grandparents were born at the beginning of this generation. My grandpa was born in 1928, my grandma in 1929. But I think about that a lot, especially with growing up when they did. My grandpa was the youngest of 13 kids. And in 6th grade, his father died, and he had to leave school to go work on the family farm. Several of his older brothers had already moved out or moved on or were serving in the military. He had to come and serve on the farm, work on the farm so his family could get by. And I remember him telling me many times how they had to scrap for meals because, again, being the youngest of 13, you kind of get what's left over. Or him telling me many times when I didn't want certain foods or certain things at his house, that when he was a kid, his favorite snack that he would get was a slice of raw onion on a cold biscuit. because that's what they had. That's all that they had left. My grandma is the youngest of 7 kids, or the second youngest of 7 kids. And I watched kind of their story. Now, granted, I came along, they were already kind of getting to retirement age. But my grandpa was just self-taught, a 6th grade education, yet he became a mechanic for Studebaker and for other automotive makers. And he just learned how to do whatever it was he needed to do. He became a master craftsman over the course of time. He had a farm of his own there in northeast Oklahoma for a while. In fact, we still can drive by the old farmhouse when we're going down to the cemetery where he is buried. And I always like to tease my grandma and say, well, there's my inheritance that you all sold like 40 years ago. Oh, shut up. That's her response to me most of the time. You just shut up. I think there's love in that, but that's typically the response I get from her. She's probably watching this today going, I don't say that. You do. I love you, but you do. But I think about how he went from that, and he worked at a B.F. Goodrich tire factory in my hometown and would work extra shifts if need be, and was just a hard worker. In fact, he was one of those that had an issue with people who kind of showed up and phoned it in, because he was there to work hard, to provide for his family, and he did what so many did in this generation. He raised 3 daughters who all raised 2 children each, and have just built on and built on and built on. We got to spend last Sunday with some of them at the wedding of one of my young cousins. But I think about my grandparents a lot, especially with kids who don't really understand anything about that generation. Maybe you can relate to this. I remember as a kid going to my grandma's refrigerator and opening it up, and there's like 15 butter containers in there. Only one of them had butter in it. And it was a guessing game as to which one it was. The other might be leftover chili, or it might be spaghetti, or it might be mashed potatoes, or just whatever we'd had the night before. And not only that, in one of her cabinets, there was actually a stack of empty butter containers. That's my inheritance. I always tell her, that's what I get to inherit one day, are your butter containers that you've kept over these years, that we as kids got in trouble for playing with and making targets we could shoot Nerf guns at. My grandpa had a wood shop, and he would have all sorts of just random stuff out there, scrap wood or tools that looked like they were broken. And I remember asking him one time, why do you have all this? He goes, because you never know when you might need it. Because he was raised in a generation where sometimes they didn't have what they needed. And they couldn't go get it. They couldn't just run to the store. They couldn't hop on Amazon and have it delivered later that day. They just had to make do with what they had. Now, you couple being raised in the Great Depression with the fact that the older members of this generation were coming of age during World War II and seeing the horrors of that play out. Again, the deadliest conflict in human history. And the older members of this generation actually might have been just old enough to serve at the tail end of this war and went and fought on the battlefields of Europe or maybe on islands in the Pacific, and not only saw the horrors of war, people dying next to them or maybe having to be the one to pull a trigger in a situation, but they came home not only with that PTSD, but kind of ingrained biases towards certain people from certain parts of the world, certain people from Germany or Italy or Japan, or maybe just somebody who looked like those people. And they remembered that was somebody that they were trying to fight against. They weren't fighting against individual people, that was against an ideal. It was hard for many of them to shake over the course of time. It was some that many carried for many years, maybe some cases all the way to their graves. This is also, though, a generation that when they did return home, they just got busy getting to work, building families, building lives, building, in some cases, actual literal towns. They built suburbs and planned communities. This was a generation that learned to harness energy so we could utilize it for our benefits, harness atomic energy for our benefits. A generation that developed vaccines that would save billions of lives from everyday common issues that we typically get. This was a generation that put a man on the moon and started the great space race with NASA. In fact, I would dare say we have very little that we have built in the later generations that wasn't built on top of what this generation started. And for that, on behalf of our generations, I say thank you. Thank you for what you all created and built and worked for. You stop and think about this silent generation, this builder generation, and there's so many ways you can describe them. But a few words that popped in my mind, these aren't on your notes, but just some words you can use to describe this generation are words like practical. Again, with my grandpa, everything had a use. Everything had a purpose. Nothing went to waste. Words like sacrifice. Not just sacrificing by fighting for our country, but sacrificing their time, working an extra shift, working overtime, maybe working a second job so their family could have what was needed. Sacrificing for their kids, sacrificing for their grandkids. Words like generous. That might be an interesting word to back up to sacrifice there, because sometimes there were people in this generation, like my grandparents, may not have money or material goods to give to somebody else, but they certainly gave of their time and their effort and their energy. As a kid, many times I would go to their house and my grandpa wouldn't be home because he was at somebody's house fixing something for them. Never wanted a dime for it. He was just happy to do what he could do. And not only that, he was the kind that was wired. If he couldn't get it figured out, he would stay there until he did. Or he would come back first thing the next day and make sure it was taken care of. This is a generation that was relational. Again, this is a generation that didn't have all the technology we have today to entertain them. So they entertained each other with, this is wild, conversation, getting to know one another, spending time together. It's this radical concept that I hope maybe, might work someday for people. This is a generation that was disciplined. Disciplined in so many ways, hardworking, but also disciplined in the way that they stuck to things. Generation that's proper in their speech, proper in their dress, proper in the fact that they had a little more defined sense of right and wrong. Generation that was proper in their dignity. And this is a generation that's loyal. They're loyal to everything, their marriages, their jobs, their churches, their country, their towns, their families, everything around them. Now stop for a second and just look at this list of descriptions here. Because yes, this describes the silent generation, but my goodness, wouldn't you like this to describe you? If somebody were to start talking about you, hey, what do you think about Kurt? Man, he has these things right here. Like, that's a pretty good description. Because let's be honest, sometimes we struggle to be able to have some of these describe us. Man, I would love for this to describe just about every generation that comes. But when we're really describing the silent generation, there's two words in particular that really jump out that aren't on this screen, that are in your notes, that I think can describe this silent generation and how the rest of society interacts with it and vice versa. Those two words are simple: respect and resentment. Here's what I mean by this. The silent generation is a generation that knows respect. They were raised in it. And when they don't see respect from younger generations, sometimes resentment can creep in. We may think this is something new, but this has kind of been around for a while. In fact, you get into 2 Kings chapter 2. One of my favorite stories in the Bible pops up here. It kind of describes this just a little bit, that this was a thing back then for them as well, too. Here's what it says. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel. Elisha's the prophet that was working there, trying to bring the word of God to them. He went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse upon them in the name of the Lord. Pause for 1 second, because some of you are like, I like this story. I like where this is going, because somebody said that to me, and I muttered some unkind things under my breath and felt bad, but I see that one of the great prophets of the Bible just did the same thing. I feel a little better about myself. But look at the next sentence, maybe my favorite sentence in the Bible. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled the 42 of the boys. You're like, okay, God didn't answer my prayer quite like that. Like God smite them. I'm not picturing, wild beasts coming out and mauling them. Some of you are like, there's some vindication. God's still on the side of me. Folks, this has been a theme throughout the years, though. Younger generations not respecting older generations, and older generations harboring resentment toward the younger generations because of this. And I think one of the easiest things for us to do is get this mentality that kind of says, well, kids these days. Remember when I was younger, my dad especially would kind of look at me and go, "Why are you wearing your pants like that? Why is your hat on backwards? What are you listening to? This isn't even music." I looked at my kids the other day. I'm like, why are you dressed like that? This isn't music. What are you listening to? Like, I'm becoming my dad day by day. And too often I'm shrugging my shoulders going, what is up with kids these days? And I'm like, oh, it's happening. It's happening. I need to start wearing sweatpants every day and just leaning into it, I guess, because it's coming, whether I want it to or not, right? Start watching The Price is Right every morning and getting dinner at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and heading to bed at 7. That's starting to sound phenomenal right now. Because, man, it's coming. Occasionally I'll have a Facebook post, and it says, this week's lesson in Kurt becoming his dad. And it's something I catch myself doing, and I open my mouth, and Kelly Whitten comes out, complaining about another car on the road or the fact my kids didn't put the garden hose back right where it's supposed to be. And I'm just like, ugh. What I said earlier, summertime was much more fun as a kid. Those of you who are younger, don't grow up. It's overrated. But why? Because the older we get, the less patience we have with younger people. That's not a new thing. I heard this quote the other day that kind of stuck with me. It says, I see no hope for the future of our people if they're dependent on the frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. If I were to ask you when that was written, some of you are like, 2019. Now, this was written 2,800 years ago by the Greek poet Hesiod. 800 years before Jesus strolled the earth. Makes you wonder how many people were looking at Jesus going, what's this punk up to today? Why is he wearing his pants like that? He got no respect for anyone or anything. 400 years later, the Greek philosopher Plato said something simpler. What is happening to our young people? They disrespect their elders. They disobey their parents. They ignore the law. They ride in the streets inflamed with wild notions. Their morals are decaying. We think that's a problem for us today. It's always been a problem. Why? Because we think we do it the right way. We think it's the only way. And I think the older we get, if we look back in our own lives with honesty, we kind of see why that's the case. There's this weird thing that happens called growing up and maturing. And when you're young, you just haven't got a chance to do that yet. In fact, I saw this breakdown of how we age, and I think it's pretty accurate. The more we look at this, the more we're honest with ourselves. As we go through life, all of us kind of go through the same process here. So all this, it's in your notes if you want to write these down. When you're in the decade of your 20s, we call this the decade of preparation. In other words, you're an adult now. Congratulations, you get to pay taxes and rent. It's wonderful. You get to do all those things that you didn't really know were coming. But you don't really have life all figured out yet. You're an adult, you're kind of figuring out who you are. It's during your 20s, I think you really actually do discover who you truly are. You're starting a family, maybe you're getting married, maybe you're not yet, but that's okay, but you're starting life. Your 30s, that's your decade of what we call initiation. You've got those things figured out, now you kind of just get to go do it. And kind of get to learn what your career is all about. Maybe you've been in your career for a few years. Maybe you've got a couple of kids. But you're getting comfortable in your own skin and you're starting to learn what the world is really all about. Your 40s and 50s, we call those the decades of domination. Not to say you're the greatest thing in the world, but really within your own life, your 40s and 50s are probably the 2 decades where you're at your peak. You're at your peak in terms of the combination of wisdom you've acquired and energy that you still have left to do what it is you're doing. You've maybe hit a management position in your job. You're full stride in your career. Doesn't mean you may not change. It may change. Your kids are growing up. Maybe they've actually graduated and you're starting to become that empty nest phase and you're realizing, man, we've still got energy. We've got time. Our kids are gone. Let's go do life together. Your 60s and 70s, we'll call those the decades of consolidation. You're thinking towards retirement if you haven't already. Maybe you have retired and you're just starting to really enjoy the fruits of a lifelong spent building up what you've got. On the flip side of that, your kids are out of the house. You've got grandkids. You're starting to maybe downsize, moving to a smaller place because just in case we really don't want them moving back in. You can be honest. We've already told our kids the day they move out, we're moving to a 1-bedroom house. Maybe just a 1-room house. We're not real sure. Maybe a studio apartment, and then they can't come back. I don't know. But you're starting to streamline things towards the future. And then your 80s and beyond, we'll just call those your decades of validation. You've got life left in you, but you also are realistic enough to know that life left in you, that your date is coming. There's an old Rascal Flatts song where they talk about that dash in between. They've got the dates you were born and the date that you died, but that dash in between is the life that you lived. And as you get into your 80s and beyond, not to sound morbid, not to sound dark, but you're starting to look back a little bit more than you're looking forward. Looking back at the life you've led, and maybe you're asking the questions, did I do enough to leave a good legacy for my kids? Did I do enough to leave a future for the people coming along behind me? I'll be 42 here in a couple of weeks. I'm kind of right in the middle of all of this. I'm not to the point where I'm looking that far down the road, but it has crossed my mind. What about the person who comes here after me? I hope that's a long time from now, but I want that person who comes here after me and takes this role to inherit an even better place than I inherited from Brad. And I inherited a pretty good place from Brad. Or from my family, what I've been given, I want to leave my kids something even better. I think that's how life's supposed to work. You want better for your kids than what you have. But I think more than stuff, more than material things, more than all of that, I think the closer I get to an older age that just keeps ticking by day, I can relate to what I read in Genesis 25 when it says that Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Part of my job, I do funeral messages for people, for families. And when I read this particular verse, I'm thinking, man, I'd love that to be a verse I say in every single sermon or funeral I do. This is somebody who lived and got to be an old man, got to be an old woman full of years, and got to be gathered to their people. This silent generation that has lost several members of it already, but several of you are still out here. You may look at this and think, man, that date for me is coming. And again, I don't want to make this sound morbid. I really don't. But you're realistic. And you may say, what can I offer the church? See, part of the crux of this series is that each generation has something unique to offer the church the others don't. What is it the silent generation can offer? I think there's two things in particular that we can look to the silent builder generation for that the others can't quite give us, and utilize those to help the church continue to thrive and grow and be healthy. Here's the first one. The builders can offer us wisdom that only a lifetime can offer, that only a lifetime can give. They offer us wisdom. Job chapter 12 says, is not wisdom found among the aged? Does not long life bring understanding? If you're part of that silent generation, or maybe even on the back end of the baby boomer generation, you're in your upper 70s now, and let me just say something, speaking on behalf of the younger generations, that cut off to Gen X and Millennial, and even down beyond that, let me just say something to you all today. We need your wisdom. We haven't lived enough life yet to have our own. We may think we do, but we don't have it just yet. But I'll also say this, we're not always the best at receiving that wisdom. So I'm going to apologize on behalf of myself and my generations for that. In particular, we're not always the best at receiving unsolicited advice, which sometimes to us can come off as a lecture. Yet, oftentimes I catch myself in a spot where I'm really not sure what to do next, and the first thing I do is run to somebody in the generation above me. Why? Because they've been there, because they've experienced it. And no matter what I've trained for or what I've studied for or what I've read, I'm just not quite there yet. I always tell people when they're getting ready to get married or getting ready to have a kid, you have no idea what's coming. Because what you're about to experience is different, even than other married couples, even than other parents, because you're different. Your kid's going to be different. It's going to be different than what I experienced. But here's what I've got to offer. It's not a lot, but here's something. Think about this because it's easy for me to look back through my life and realize the people who have poured into me. And not to say that I don't respect what younger people know, but it's the older people who have lived the life that I'm kind of starting to go through now. People whose kids have just graduated high school that know what it's like to have kids moving into their tween years and into their middle school years. It's people who are having young kids that can look up to people like me who have kids that have already gone through that phase a few years ago. We can look to the people who were just ahead of us, and we can look to maybe how they've given us that advice. I think a lot to my Uncle Larry. He was born in 1945 at the end of this generation, a very wise man. But he was a person too who never once just sat down and lectured me. If he knew that there was something I needed to hear, he knew how to package it in a way that I was going to receive it. That comes through relationship. That comes through getting to know somebody. It comes through knowing for me that he could package it through humor or through a round of golf. And I would listen. I think to my teachers that I had that were part of this generation that took the time to invest in us to know how we would receive what it was they wanted to give us. Beyond that silent generation, every generation below has wisdom, but the others below it don't. And when we think about this particular wisdom, wisdom isn't simply showing off your resume and showing off the diplomas on your wall. It's life too. In fact, we'd see it like this. Wisdom is knowledge plus experience. Think of it like this. Let's say that each generation was represented by a cup or by a vessel. If you're in Gen Z, your cup is probably not very big. Just think like you got a small drink at QT or something, one of those little small cups. You get to the millennials, their cup's a little bit bigger. Why? There's a little more life. So when the Gen Z cup runs out, millennials can pour a little bit in before they run out. Now granted, they don't have as much quite in their cup. Gen X, their cup's a little bigger. Okay, it's kind of like, the large you can get. And they can pour in a little bit more to those below them because they've got life that's filled theirs. You get to the boomer generation and it's like the gallon jug, that big, huge cup at QT that's just so gross and unhealthy to fill with Dr. Pepper. But we do it anyway because we're free Americans and nobody can tell us otherwise. You've got the big cup. You get to the silent generation, it's like the Gatorade jug that they dump on a coach after a football game. It's got so much in it. And you can give and give and give because there's so much that you've acquired over the course of time. This is a generation that has accomplished so much, that has done so much. But I think too, what makes this generation special, something I'm starting to realize a little bit more day by day as I get older, is everything they've accomplished is nothing in comparison to what was given to them by Jesus. Nothing in comparison to what Christ accomplished for us and for you. And I think as we get older, if you have accepted Christ as your Savior, you understand this more. Everything I have, it's not because of what I did. It's not because of my accomplishments. It's because of what Jesus did for me. And folks, that is worth passing down to the next generations. Remember, one of our core values here at this church, we want to boldly invest in the next generation. What you've acquired and accumulated is something you can hand down to the generations that are already here and are still to come. I'd love for all of us as we get older to be like the writer of Psalm 71 when it says, even when I'm old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all those who are to come. Leaving a Christ-like legacy is something that doesn't cost you a dime, doesn't cost you anything materially or financially. It just asks for your prayers. It just asks for your attention. It just asks for your words. It asks for your focus to not be necessarily just on the last little bit of life, but on how you can give back to those who are coming below. I can stop and think about all the people in my life. I could rattle off name after name after name of people from this silent generation and the one before it that helped me get to where I am today. People from my church, people from the schools I was at. I can think about a guy that was my third grade Sunday school teacher who taught me a song to help me learn the books of the Bible and how that stuck with me. And even still, when I'm flipping through, I can go to that song. I think about the people who would bring us snacks to children's church when I was a kid, or help serve with VBS when I was that young, or the people who poured into us just different times throughout the years. The older guys in the church that would let me hang out with them during service because we didn't really have kids or youth programming, and I was about the only youth at our church for a stretch. Those people who just let me be with them, let me hang out with them, let me watch them and observe them. You've got a wisdom that only a lifetime can give. Here's the second thing that the silent generation can do for the church today. And that's learn to finish well. Again, not to sound morbid, not to say that we're trying to push you all out, not to say that we're ready to see you all go. But one thing we all have in common is we all have an expiration date on our physical bodies. And if you have given your life to Christ, we know what's waiting for us on the other side of that last breath. And for all of us, that's our goal, is to get there. There may be times that you feel as though you've reached an age where you can't really give much of anything anymore. Maybe physically you can't. Maybe physically you can't, go get on your hands and knees and serve kids anymore. Or you can't help with the building team anymore because you just can't do the things you used to do. Can I tell you what you can do? You can pray. You can give encouragement. You can give advice. You can still use the mind that's in your head and your heart. And you can still give things to us that can't be taken away. 2 Corinthians 4 says, do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away. Inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Or Psalm 73, my heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Intentionally taking time to invest in the future generations, folks, I think makes it easier to avoid any resentment towards what that generation might do that's different than yours. I could sit and tell you story after story, but I can just tell you a couple real quick ones from folks in this generation. Talked about my grandma earlier. She can't get out of her chair much anymore, but man, she can still pray. And I know she does for me. I know she does for her church there in Miami, Oklahoma. I know she does for people that she doesn't even know, because she wants them to come to know Jesus. I can think of a lady that I didn't get to know super well. She was a part of the church that Jennifer grew up in for years and years. And when I did get to know her, I realized I went to high school with her grandson. And so we connected really well. But by the time I got to know her, she was in her wheelchair and sassy as could be. Every week I'd tell her I was just going to push her down the slope if she was any more sassy. And she'd bring it on. Miss B, we called her. And I'll never forget the letters she wrote to me, hand wrote, 4-page letters. When I started ministry, just saying, you've got this. We're here for you. We're praying for you. And that she knitted Elsie this crocheted bear before she even knew whether she was going to be a boy or a girl when she first found out we were pregnant with her. And the best part about that was she didn't do that just for me. She did that for every single person in our age group at First Christian Church in Oklahoma. Folks, you can give the younger generation something that can never be taken away. So what do we do with all this? 2-part takeaway today. First, if you're in that generation, if you're a builder, if you're a part of the silent generation, here's my challenge for you today. Invest in a legacy for the next generation. I want nothing more than this church right here to not just survive, but thrive after I'm long gone. And after all of us here are long gone, people come in after, and this church is thriving and bringing people to Jesus all across this area because of the seeds that have already been sown, because of what's already been done, feeds what's going to be done. So invest in the next generation. To the rest of us, to the boomers, to the Gen Xers, to everybody else here in the room and online, what can we do with this? Honor and respect what this generation has built. If things are going to change, we're going to have to change things that this generation has built, but we honor and respect it as we do. Once heard a great phrase that as we look forward, you should honor the past but not worship it. Honor what was created. When I was interviewing for this job here, they were asking me about my thoughts and vision for the future. And I said, I've got thoughts for what I would like to see the church be. But I know one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to keep the foundation that was built here. Because it's a good foundation. It's a strong foundation. And things, of course, are going to have to change because the world changes. But we honor and we respect what was put before us. We have been given such an awesome responsibility, church, to go bring people to Jesus, to teach them about Jesus, to show them Jesus. And man, we can't do this if we're all going in opposite directions. I pray that over these next few weeks, that's our goal. We learn each other better, to get to know each other better so we can love each other better. Let's pray. Father, we are so thankful for your church. God, we're thankful that we come from such diverse places, but God, we come with one thing in common, to serve and worship you. So God, I pray as we go through these next few weeks, learning about each other, God, we would keep that in mind. That's our goal, that's our focus, is to bring people to you. Pray this in Jesus' name.